Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Backyard Forestry. This is our last presentation of the year. Season's greetings to everyone. Tonight's presentation is Building Resilience in New Jersey's Forests. The NJFA is a 501c3 organization. We advocate for all forests in New Jersey, supporting sustainable use and science-based forest management, and are the voice of woodland owners in New Jersey, both public and private. This presentation is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to constitute specific legal, tax, or other advice. No claims, promises, or guarantees are made about its accuracy, completeness, adequacy, or suitability. We encourage landowners to consult with their own attorneys, accountants, and foresters for professional advice concerning woodlands and otherwise. On the legislative and regulatory front, a lot has been going on. I'll actually start with NJ-REAL, R-E-A-L. I've spoken about that previously. That's the Resilient Environments and Landscape Rules. Those were formally adopted and will be published in January in the Register. They are more than 1,000 pages in length, and despite many believing that they relate only to coastal areas, they in fact affect all of the state and do affect certain forestry activities as well. And we'll keep you updated as those rules roll out. Farmland assessment has been in the news. The state announced an online filing portal for farmland assessment as being in test and anticipated to be active for filings in 2026 for the 27 tax year. So we will keep you posted on that as well. There may be some process differences and some things that need to be done with your forester in order to access, to allow your forester access to that portal, but we will watch for the processes and procedures as they come out. So while we're talking about farmland assessment, there's been a lot of conversation about it in the news in the last year. I want to make something very clear. Farmland assessment of woodlands is the most important program supporting forest sustainability, resilience, and wildfire defense in New Jersey. This is hands down. The number of acres affected are dramatic from that program. It requires participants to prepare and follow woodland management and forest stewardship plans. Those plans are required to be reviewed and approved by the state, and there are ongoing inspections of activity by the New Jersey Forest Service, typically every 3 years. Landowners manage their forests at their own expense, and they defer development and other highly profitable uses. In exchange, compliant landowners receive a reduction in real estate taxes only on their undeveloped woodlands, while paying full taxes on their home and home site. There are 2 million acres of forests in New Jersey, split about evenly between public and private. On the public side, due to limited money and personnel resources, as well as other challenges, those forests have generally become neglected and are in a fuel-loaded condition. Fortunately, nearly 400,000 acres of privately owned woodlands are included in the Farmland Assessment Program. That means that the vast majority of responsible science-based forest management being conducted in New Jersey is by private landowners at their own expense. That brings me back to where I started. Farmland assessment of woodlands is the most important and effective forest conservation program in New Jersey today. One more note on legislative and regulatory. A bill known as A682-S699, establishing a program in the State Agricultural Development Committee for acquisition of easements on privately owned woodlands that did not previously exist, did pass Assembly appropriations today, and it is anticipated and hoped that it will go to full vote before the end of the legislative session. Tonight's guest is Matthew Olson. I call him Matt, but he's Dr. Matthew Olson. He is an associate professor of environmental science at Stockton University. You may recall meeting him at previous NJFA webinars and at our annual meeting, which, by the way, this coming year is Saturday, March 21st, 2026 at Rutgers University. So mark your calendar now. Announcements will go out after the new year. So if you don't know Matt, Matt is not only one of the smartest people you'll ever meet, but he's a gifted and engaging speaker. He'll be covering building resilience in New Jersey's forests with a focus on shortleaf pine, a fire-adapted, wind-resistant, drought-tolerant species perfect for a changing climate. To tell you a little bit more about Matt, he grew up in Medford Township on the western edge of the Pine Barrens. He took an early interest in trees and forests, spending time exploring the woods or fishing the lakes of Medford. When he found out that forestry could be a career, he knew exactly what he wanted to study. He received undergraduate degrees in forestry from Paul Smith's College and the University of Maine, and his graduate studies included the University of Tennessee, where he studied oak regeneration ecology, and the University of Maine, where he continued to study forest regeneration in northern conifer hardwood forests. For his dissertation, he combined long-term forestry experiments in Maine to evaluate forest regeneration under alternative sustainable timber harvesting practices. While Matt's research has spanned a broad geography, he continues to maintain a very strong interest and focus on the forests of New Jersey. Next month's presentation, January 15th, there was a big attendance at our presentation last month discussing the deer population. And the folks from New Jersey Fish and Wildlife, Jody Powers and Brian Shum, will be back talking all things deer, including deer hunting, community-based deer management, hunting licenses, deer population, vehicle incident stats, hunt results, forest and forest landowner partnerships, and more. Watch for our announcements. They'll be coming out by email close to that date, and we will also be posting it on Facebook. And now we're pleased to present Building Resilience in New Jersey's Forests with Professor Matt Olson.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Rich. Very, very generous with those words. Appreciate it.
Most welcome.
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen. And if you wouldn't mind, just give me a thumbs up if it comes up for you. Do that. Right, so you should be seeing my desktop screen now. Can you see that, Rich?
Yes, I can. I can see the desktop, but it's not full screen yet with the presentation.
All right, so then let me do this. So now can you see the full
Yes,
screen
perfect.
presentation? Cool.
Yes.
I'm just going to hide these floating controls. All right, cool. Well, again, thank you, Rich. Thank you for the generous intro, and good evening, everyone. As Rich mentioned, I'm an associate professor at Stockton University. I usually just go by Matt. I'm fine with that, but if you want to call me Matthew, that's fine. Just don't call me Mr. Olson or Dr. Olson for that matter. I usually don't respond well to that, but just call me Matt. That's fine. Yeah, and so for tonight, I just wanted to share with you just some information about shortleaf pine. It's going to be kind of a broad introduction to the species. And at the end, I'm going to talk more about how we might use shortleaf pine as a way of building resilience in New Jersey's forests. So really, it's going to be kind of more toward the end of the talk. I'm going to start getting more into resilience. But hopefully, as I talk more about the species, you can kind of see why I'm trying to promote shortleaf as a species that I think is well positioned for the future, not just in New Jersey, but elsewhere, but certainly in New Jersey's forests. And then also any opportunity to talk about trees in general. Shortleaf pine is certainly one of my favorite. I could put that maybe in the top 10 species. It's really hard for dendrology professors to identify their top 10 species, but shortleaf certainly would fall on my list of top 10. So any chance to kind of brag on shortleaf, I certainly will jump at it. And so I guess as far
And
as
Matt, do you want to run that poll and quiz early, or when do you want to run the first one?
yeah. Why don't we do that? Why don't we do the first?
All righty. I'll give it my best shot.
Okay.
All right. This
So
is
do I have to
poll.
unshare my screen, I guess?
No, I think I may be able to launch it. Let's see what happens.
Okay.
Can you
Yeah.
see it?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. It does have a scroll up. So we are getting responses already.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
And away we go.
Okay. I'll end the poll. And basically, it looks like north is just a hair below central, and south is a little less. And I live in another state is in there, so you're attracting interstate commerce. And
Good.
have you ever heard of shortleaf pine? More yes than no.
Good.
And which tree species has the highest population in New Jersey? Now, this is for you. White oak, red maple, pitch pine, or shortleaf pine? Matt,
It is pitch pine.
that I'm sure surprised everyone.
Right. Right. Well, I think it's a good place to start from because surprise, surprise, we will be talking about pitch pine a little bit. It's kind of hard to talk about shortleaf pine without at least kind of talking about pitch pine a little bit, especially here in New Jersey. Um, but yeah, so let me kind of move on to the next. There we go. All right, so some of my overarching goals for this evening's talk, and this is kind of the order in which I see the goals themselves. So kind of like priority for me is really to kind of promote awareness of shortleaf pine. Very, very interesting species, and I hope you kind of come away with this with also an interest in the species, and then of course also promoting its conservation more broadly. And hopefully that comes through as well in the talk that there are some serious concerns regarding shortleaf pine. Its population is in decline. We'll talk more about that later. Um, and also, what I would like to do also is just to generally increase the level of interest in establishing and growing shortleaf pine across the state of New Jersey, and this would include northern New Jersey as well, which shortleaf pine, as far as I know, is not well represented in northern New Jersey, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it couldn't grow well there under certain conditions. And then, as of course, as we're thinking about projected future climate, the trees that we're growing today and we're regenerating today are going to be in a different climate a century from now, trees living a century or longer. And so we want to ensure that we're establishing trees that are going to be well adapted to projected future conditions. And it just so turns out that shortleaf seems to be one of those species that kind of like checks the boxes in numerous ways, including being well positioned to New Jersey's projected future. Um, so I'm part of a larger group that are pictured here. I wasn't at this one event where this picture was taken, but it's a group of scientists have recently come together within the last year or so with kind of a shared interest in shortleaf pine, just kind of realizing that it's a pretty understudied species. So kind of like our group effort has been to kind of like report on the state of the knowledge that we have about the species. What do we know? Identify some of the knowledge gaps, and then also talk about challenges and opportunities for conservation and management of the species within the range and how that varies with different ecological settings within shortleaf's very large geographic range. And so I can talk more about some of the kind of the deliverables or the products of our discussions at the very end. But yeah, so that's just know that I'm not the only one that's working on this, but there's definitely quite a bit of interest in the species, and it's hopefully a growing interest. It seems like it is, but hopefully we
Matt,
sustain that.
could you estimate the age of that tree in the picture?
Geez, I have absolutely no clue. I haven't been to the site before, but that is just a fantastic shortleaf pine. I don't think I've ever seen one quite that large.
There is a question in the Q&A. Is shortleaf pine the same species as eastern white pine?
No, it is not. So shortleaf pine is what we call a hard pine. Eastern white pine is a soft pine. So they are both in the genus Pinus, but they are quite different taxonomically, even within that group. And so white pine will typically get to a much larger size within areas where it grows well than something like a shortleaf. Shortleaf can certainly get to a large size, but white pine can reach massive size and is much more of a northern species. But that's a good question. And hopefully this discussion here, especially as I move on and start talking about the species, it'll become a little more obvious. It's kind of the distinguishing features of shortleaf and that kind of thing that could help you with identifying it and separating it from something like a white pine. All right, so for my outline, pretty rough sketch here. Just I'm going to start talking about the species, just kind of bragging on it a little bit, focusing on its identifying features, its morphology, and I do this largely by way of comparing it to pitch pine because there is quite a bit of morphological and ecological overlap between the species. So it's nice to kind of see them side by side and really point out the distinguishing features and what separates one from the other. I'll talk a little bit about the ecology, its life history, get more into like its fire ecology, which kind of combines with its life history, some interesting features. Then we'll talk more about kind of where we are today, where we were in the past in terms of shortleaf abundance, which kind of frames kind of the concern for shortleaf pine that it's a species in decline, and hopefully that comes through in what I present. And then finally, I'll just wrap it up with a short discussion on how I think shortleaf pine is a species well positioned for the future. And in fact, it's not just me. There are many others that are kind of promoting shortleaf pine as a species in the Mid-Atlantic region and even further north when we think about projected future changes and whatnot. All right, so just to talk about the species a bit. So the shortleaf pine, that's going to be the most common name you'll hear ascribed to the species. And so the genus and species name is Pinus annectionata. So echinata is in reference to the spiny the spines that are on the cones of shortleaf pine. So echinata just refers to it's like it's just basically a spiny feature. But interestingly, as I was doing research into shortleaf, it has so many different names have been ascribed to the species. And as somebody who studies trees and teaches dendrology, I don't think I've ever encountered a species that has quite just the list of names that have been ascribed to it. So like shortleaf pine. So here you can just see just the listing of some of the names. And this isn't by any means an exhaustive list. There are actually a few that I kept off of this because it's just for space purposes. But it's gone by a wide range of names. And I think it's interesting, and maybe it's somewhat symptomatic of how shortleaf, its geographic range is fairly large, so it occurs in a wide variety of different environments. And just locally, you get a lot of colloquial names that kind of like crop up and stuff to describe species. So some of it, I think, kind of speaks to some of the variation across the species range and some of the cultural variation and such, and its uses over time and that kind of thing, and just observations of it. But yeah, for now on, we'll just refer to shortleaf pine. I'm not going to go through this exhaustive list. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm gonna do a comparison as I talk about the identifying features, the distinguishing features of shortleaf. I like to do it by way of comparing it against pitch pine because there is a lot of morphological and ecological overlap between them. And I'm just gonna tout my own work here. So what you're seeing before you, two pictures, hand-drawn images that I've done myself. These are trees that are actually on they're actually living trees on my property. They look like snags, according to these pictures. I'm just not very good at drawing out the details of the live crown. So this just kind of shows kind of basically the woody parts of the tree that were pretty obvious to me. So these are two trees that are growing on our property, shortleaf to the left and a pitch pine to the right. And so this will be my introduction to talking about pitch and shortleaf, and really with a focus on shortleaf pine to help kind of distinguish it from pitch pine. So we'll start with the foliage. So pitch pine, typically, and I would say more often than not, you're going to see it 3 needles per bunch or 3 needles per fascicle. The needles are longer than shortleaf pines. They're rigid and they're kind of thicker and heavier needles than that of shortleafs. They tend to be a little bit lighter in colored, so kind of yellow green to green, but kind of a little bit lighter in color. And pitch pine's needles persist for say 2 to 3 seasons. So like they're evergreen foliage, but they don't last forever. They basically last say 2 seasons. Most of them are going to drop off at the end of their second season, and then some may persist into the third growing season. Whereas shortleaf pine presents its foliage as 2 needles or 3 needles per fascicle. You can find it on the same tree as 2s and 3 needles. And so it's just a combination of 2s and 3s. The needles are shorter, so the foliage is shorter, and they're not as rigid. They're more flexible and kind of delicate. They tend to be a little bit darker green in color than pitch pines, and they persist for longer. So they may persist something like 3 to 5 seasons as opposed to pitch pines, 2 to 3. And so I kind of just show the image, and I'll kind of just move my cursor so you can see it. So here's a pitch pine here, here's a shortleaf pine here, and you can see the differences in the needle color and the needle length and such. Just kind of point that out. All right, so talking about cones, the reproductive parts. So these are female cones, mature female cones. And so you can see on the left there, that's 2 examples of pitch pine, and I'll just kind of hold up here. Here's our 2 examples here. So here's the open cone right here. And then here's one of the closed cones of pitch pine. So this is a serotinous cone, collected this from the pine plains from a pygmy pine. So basically, in theory, there are seeds within this that are dormant but viable, kind of waiting for a fire to trigger the opening of the cone that would release the seed. So this is one of pitch pine's adaptations to fire, kind of one of the extreme adaptations that pitch pine has. So we'll kind of put these side by side. So now you have a pitch pine here and a shortleaf pine here. So shortleaf pine cones are going to be smaller and they're more egg-shaped when they're open, whereas pitch pines are going to be larger and more globe-shaped. And unlike pitch pine, you're not going to find serotinous cones in shortleaf pine, or at least in pure shortleaf. The two species do hybridize, so you may find some intermediates that have maybe some intermediate forms, including maybe intermediate serotiny or something. But as far as I know, there are no serotinous shortleaf pine, pure shortleaf pine. Another difference between them is that I would say shortleaf consistently will have more cones persisting within the crown for a longer period of time than pitch pine. I often see that there will be sometimes a pitch pine that doesn't have a lot of cones that are kind of holding on. They just don't seem to have a lot of cones in the crown, where shortleaf pine, I almost always see lots of cones just being held up in the crown. So that those cones tend to persist in the crowns of the trees for longer in shortleaf for some reason. Okay, so the bark, I know pine bark, especially we talk about platy pine bark, they all kind of look the same, but if you kind of learn some of the subtleties, you start seeing the differences. So I would describe pitch pines as generally being a darker bark than that of shortleafs. It tends to have more protruding plates. So in other words, the plates almost seem a little bit blocky, a little bit more of a separation between the bark plates. Um, and they also tend to be a little bit more irregular, whereas shortleaf pines, again, so lighter bark, the bark plates tend to sit a little bit flatter against the stem. There isn't as much of a separation between the plates. So you can see a separation between the plates, but it isn't like a deep separation. Another feature of pitch pine, which I'll kind of point this out down in this image here, is that pitch pine is more likely to form these needle tufts along the stem and sometimes on the branches. So those are dormant buds that are just underneath the bark that are just pitch pine is a very sprouty tree. It's one of its adaptations, is just its ability to bounce back after being heavily damaged by fire or other factors. And so as part of that, pitch pine just tends to have a lot more of these needle tufts along the stem. Shortleaf pine, much less likely to show that feature unless it's a tree that's stressed and it's getting more sunlight on the side or something, it's epicormic branching. But generally, it just doesn't really show the needle tuft characteristic quite like pitch pine does. But kind of an interesting feature, shortleaf, is shown in this image to the right, and that's where that arrow is pointed to. If you look, there's like a little divot in the bark. And this is usually in the mature tree bark. That little divot is what's known as a resin pocket or a pitch pocket. And so mature shortleaf pine will often have lots of these on the bark plates, which can make it pretty easy to identify them when they have that. In fact, if you kind of look on that zeroed in image of the bark, it almost looks like somebody shot it with shotgun or something with all those little holes in it. Those are all the little pitch pockets. Pitch pine doesn't produce that. I've never seen a pitch pine do this. Shortleaf pine does do this, does produce this, but usually it's when they're mature, they show it. It's basically the bark starts sloughing off and it becomes more obvious when you see it. But not all shortleaf will show it. But if you see it, that's usually a good indicator that it's shortleaf. That's the bark. Now, this is more of if you take a step back from the tree and you kind of just observe its habit or if its overall growth form. Kind of one way to kind of think about these species that shortleaf pine is more likely to grow a nice straight stem than pitch pine. Pitch pine tends to grow very crooked and tends to develop a sinuous kind of crown or stem. So we call that sinuosity, which is the opposite of straightness. So pitch pine much more likely to exhibit sinuosity than shortleaf pine. So you almost think like shortleaf pine. It's the nature of its primary growth is that it really seems to oppose the draw of gravity. Like it just seems like it's much more negative gravitropic or something. It's kind of like growing against the draw of gravity much more strongly than that of pitch pine. And then also pitch pine is just more likely to fork. So you get lot more forks in the stem, heavier branches a lot of times on shortleaf pine relative to the size of the stem. It just seems to put a lot more into individual large branch growth than shortleaf pine, which tends to produce kind of smaller branches, maybe more numerous, but kind of smaller diameter branches relative to the stem. So often we kind of think of shortleaf just kind of having like a nicer stem form from a timber value standpoint. So it kind of has more timber value in part just because it kind of grows nicer and straighter that way. But you can grow a nice straight pitch pine. I'm not saying that can't happen, but shortleaf is more likely to grow that way. And then even I kind of showed this image before of the seedling sapling stage pitch and shortleaf is that you can already see some of the differences in the growth form. That pitch pine just kind of grows kind of all over, it just has a more complicated kind of growth pattern where shortleaf is just nice and straight even at this stage. And you can see that quite clearly. And then I would say as far as Christmas tree form, this is more of a joke as I'm saying this. So what we do at our household, we like to find a local pine tree and we cut it down. We make it our year's Charlie Brown Christmas tree. And so, because we're in the Pine Barrens, we have lots of pitch pine to choose from. So over the years, the last few years, we've been cutting pitch pine primarily. And so that's what you see on the left here. So that's a pitch pine, I think, from last year. And so you can see it as a form for a Christmas tree. It's just really bushy. It's just kind of shooting out. Doesn't have a nice Christmas tree kind of form. Whereas I would say the shortleaf, which is this year's tree, this is our Charlie Brown tree this year. So this one on the right has much more of a straight form. And yeah, it's not, I wouldn't call it a great full Christmas tree, but I think it's a handsomer Christmas tree personally. And I get to give a little shout out to our dog Hazel here. So looking at me, wondering what's going on. All right, so let's get back to this. All right, so that's some of the morphological differences between pitch and shortleaf pine. Hopefully, by way of that comparison, maybe you're a little more comfortable if you happen to see those species out in the woods. Maybe you can separate a shortleaf from a pitch. All right, so to get back into like just talking about general ecology of the species, it's good to kind of start with the geographic range. And so it turns out shortleaf pine has the largest geographic range of the big four southern pine species. And when I say the big four, it's loblolly pine, shortleaf pine, longleaf pine, and slash pine. So those are like the four most commercially important southern pine species in our southern forests. And so shortleaf not only has the largest geographic range, but it extends the furthest north of the big four. Um, And so you can see, I could kind of like this map here. So you see there's, this is an old image from Mattoon's 1915 publication. Basically, it's on the life history of shortleaf pine, kind of an early publication on the species. And here you kind of see two ranges indicated here. So you see that lighter color. That lighter color is the botanic range or the botanical range as he has described here. So that would represent kind of the range of maybe within the range where it could grow and where in some cases where it does grow. Probably most of the cases where it does grow, but certainly where he thought it could grow. And then you have the darker symbols here that's kind of overlaid on top of that, which is the commercial range. So that's like where you kind of expect shortleaf pine to be harvested commercially for wood products and that kind of thing. So you can kind of see the combination of these two things here. And so when Mattoon described this range, he described it as a 24 state range. But a lot of times you also see shortleaf's range is described as a 22 state range. It seems like more commonly we call it a 22 state range these days, whereas I think he identified it as a 24 state range. And I think he was basing it on the botanical range, and maybe where it could possibly grow, or maybe where reports came in where it was growing.
Well,
Um,
interesting, pre the climate change period that we're in, he
yeah,
still identified New Jersey on his map in the botanical range.
it definitely, and even if you look, it extends up the Hudson Valley too.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we're certainly at the northern edge of the range, northern tip, but it even goes north of New Jersey.
Right.
It's found on Long Island too. So it's certainly a species that can grow in our climate and our soils, statewide, I'd say too. And then I just want to point this out. So the map that you see on the left, this is a more recent map that shows the dark green shows the states where it occurs. The lighter green shows the counties where it occurs. And so it gives you a little bit more of a sense of the spatial distribution kind of at the county level. So a little bit more detail there. Okay, so you'd imagine a large geographic range spanning 22 states or 24 states, however you look at it. So kind of what would coincide with something like that is a wide range of climatic variation. So a lot of variation in terms of temperature and precipitation within that range. And so here you see two heat maps or thematic maps that show continuous variation in mean annual temperature, and that's on the left, and mean annual precipitation on the right. And overlaying on top of that is Little's historical distribution maps for shortleaf pine. So I think we can kind of treat that as like kind of best of our knowledge where it currently exists, and at least the extent of where it currently exists. And kind of the most noticeable thing to pop out of this really is just how much variation we see within that very broad geographic range. But one thing to keep in mind is not like shortleaf occurs uniformly within this entire range. It's going to be very patchy and it's going to vary quite a bit. Like shortleaf generally does not grow above 3,000 feet in the southern Appalachians. So some of the really like in the really light blue areas and the mean annual temperature that you see kind of like between Tennessee and North Carolina, that those are really high elevation. I mean, that's 5,000 feet or more. You're not going to find shortleaf growing at those elevations. So it's not like shortleaf is growing all throughout this, but certainly throughout the range, we do see quite a bit of variation in temperature and precipitation. And if you kind of focus on southern New Jersey, it's going to be kind of the cooler and even a little bit drier end of the spectrum in terms of where shortleaf occurs climatically, according to this. And it's actually not too far off from what you see in the Ozarks too. So I'll just kind of circle. So here's the Missouri Ozarks here, which is the Ozark Plateau. You can see here too. So not the coloration kind of matches pretty well with southern New Jersey, both at the northern extent, but at different kind of ends of the range. All right, so thinking in terms of a geographic range, certainly important to kind of think at that very broad scale, get a sense of like the kind of the extent of a species distribution. But what's really important is you got to zero in a little bit. Like, so we know that they don't occur uniformly across within that range, but instead they're going to be found on specific kind of habitats. And so for shortleaf, we often associate the species more with upland soils and upland sites. Now, as far as a wetland indicator status, it is classified as a facultative upland species. So yeah, it's primarily going to be found in the uplands, but you may find it in wetlands. But I'll be honest, I don't really see it growing in wetlands all that often. We do have some on campus here, and if any of my students are on this Zoom call right now, they're going to call me out because it was 2 weeks back, I gave them their last weekly quiz in dendrology, and I took them to a shortleaf pine in a wetland to throw them off a bit. It was one of the challenging trees I threw at them that day. But it does occur in wetlands, but it's just not very often occurring in wetlands. But so yeah, we often associate with xeric sites or kind of drier sites. So upland sites, drier sites, often underlain with soils that are coarser textured, sandy soils that are not particularly good at holding water against the draw of gravity. So where you have lower water holding capacity, and also sites that tend to be more exposed. So more exposed to incoming solar radiation. So in the northern hemisphere, that's going to be south and west facing slopes and that kind of thing, which tend to dry out a little bit more. So it tends to occur on those drier sites, which speaks to some of its adaptations. It's a species that's considered well adapted to drought and to droughty soils, drought conditions, and that kind of thing. And so I like to throw this. Here's a picture here that's taken from Steagle Mountain. It's the one you see on the right. This is from Steagle Mountain Fire Tower on Peck Ranch Conservation Area in southern Missouri. And so kind of the idea here is you're looking, in this case, north and east. And what you're seeing is a southwest facing slope where you can see at the top of that slope, you can see all the evergreens there. That's predominantly shortleaf pine. There's probably some eastern red cedar mixed into there a little bit, but that's predominantly shortleaf. And if you could kind of pan around the landscape here, you'd see a lot of this kind of evergreen cover toward the kind of the middle to upper portion of the slopes on the south facing side and on the tops of the ridges kind of throughout the landscape. So it's pretty noticeable, pretty repeating in terms of what you see on the landscape. And so this is pretty typical of shortleaf pine. It's going to be more of an upland species and on exposed landforms. All right, so we could talk a little bit more about some of the drought adaptations in shortleaf pine, and then we could talk a little bit about fire frequency and its adaptations to frequent fire. And so shortleaf, part of its strategy with dealing with drought and being able to tolerate drought has to do with the development of a large root system. So it's a species that is known for allocating a lot to its roots. So it's going to produce a large root system relative to its shoot. So that kind of helps it to kind of meet the needs of the shoot by way of having a large root system that's effective at foraging for soil moisture to support that larger shoot or that above ground portion. It can also develop a very deep taproot where the soils permit that to happen. So if you have these are like relatively deep, unconsolidated, well-drained soils, like in the coastal plain, like here in South Jersey, if it's a well-drained, like a very well-drained soil, it can develop a very deep taproot. So that's going to allow it to access some deeper moisture, and it's going to give it really good anchorage, and a variety of other benefits. So it's also considered something like a deep taproot certainly can help with acquiring soil moisture, where soil moisture is more limiting, but it can also provide really good anchorage, and it can actually help improve wind firmness and help resist winds and things like that and keep the tree upright for a longer period, potentially extending its longevity on sites that might be a little more exposed to wind. And so, shortleaf growing on these droughty sites, and we often associate with droughtier soils. Soils are sites that are exposed and tend to dry out more. These tend to also be more fire-prone locations on a landscape. And so what we often associate with shortleaf pine is fire. So fire tends to select for shortleaf, where you get a specific type of fire regime, where fire is occurring pretty frequently, probably low to moderate intensity type fire, more on the low end of the spectrum. I would posit is going to favor more shortleaf over other species on these kinds of sites. And so just to kind of show you just kind of how fire or projected estimated fire return interval fire regimes, how that matches up with shortleaf's geographic range. You can see this image in the middle. Again, this is a map, thematic map that in this case is showing variation in mean fire return interval, or the number of years, the average number of years between subsequent fires. So that's going to be how this is, like the coloration is classified based on that. And so this was a model that was developed by a group of scientists out of the University of Missouri. And what they did was they used physical aspects of the environment to actually predict what the fire regimes were from 1650 to 1850. So it's a period of time that spans kind of the westward expansion, European arrival to, basically early settlement periods and throughout much of the range and that kind of thing. So it captures kind of a wide range of variation, but kind of what we may have expected more pre-European arrival kind of forest conditions as far as fire regime. And so what we see throughout the range, just kind of generally speaking, is that the mean return interval throughout most of shortleaf's range is more of like a 2 to 14 year over the where we'd expect to find shortleaf. So yeah, like you can see some of those cooler colors, like the blues and the yellows and the greens, but that matches up with high elevations in the southern and central Appalachians where probably shortleaf was not a part. But really where we would have expected to find shortleaf is in the areas where you see a lot more fire happening, much more frequent fire. Where we see within the range where fire was most frequent, more in the southern coastal portions of the range. You can see even in some of the dark orange in this case, even as short as 2 years, 2 to 4 years return intervals, which is kind of there'd be areas where it certainly co-occurred with longleaf pine. And then I like to point out too is that if you look at kind of the area in New Jersey, and mostly in southern, maybe a little bit in central New Jersey, where shortleaf's range occurs, you look at the coloration within that, that matches a mean return interval, something like 6 to 14 years between burns on average over this period of 200 years for shortleaf here in New Jersey. So again, relatively frequent fire recurrence that would select for species with adaptations to frequent fire like shortleaf pine. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the adaptations to fire that we see in shortleaf. I'm going to break it up into two broad categories of resistance and resilience to fire, starting with resistance. And so when we say resistance, we're talking about preventing damage. So it's about the individual preventing damage to itself. Like what does it do to kind of prevent that from happening, preventing disruption? Well, when it comes to fire, it's really going to come down to things like thick bark is a really effective resistance strategy, especially insulated bark. Not all thick bark is going to be equal in terms of insulating against fire. But pines, for example, tend to produce really good fire, thick insulated bark. They have that capability. A lot of pines do, at least the hard pines. And so shortleaf pine certainly develops thick insulated bark, and it does so starting from a young age. It starts accumulating this insulated bark at a relatively small size and young age, so such that it's even somewhat resistant to fire, even as a smaller individual, as a juvenile tree. And so here's an image here that, yes, I clearly point out this actually was taken. This is a ponderosa pine, not a shortleaf pine, but you get the point. It's just very, very thick bark relative to the size of the tree. Maybe not shortleaf. I'm not sure shortleafs is to this extreme, but certainly shortleaf's adaptation to frequent fire, I think in ways it shares some similarities to that of ponderosa pine, which is also a species of high frequency, low severity, low intensity fire regimes. Something else I want to point out too, and I kind of alluded to this a moment ago, is how shortleaf pine kind of achieves fire resistance at a smaller size, smaller diameter than many of its associated hardwoods. And so these are basically two repeated images taken of the same two individuals immediately following a prescribed burn. That's the image on the left, and then a few months after, and that's the one on the right. And so the orange arrow that you see, that's pointing to a black oak. So that's a black oak seedling sapling that's growing in an area, in an environment, in this case, in a canopy gap on Wharton State Forest. The blue arrow that you see, that's pointing to a shortleaf pine. And if you kind of look closely at these two trees, you can kind of make it out. The black oak is actually slightly larger, both in diameter and in height, compared to the shortleaf pine in this case. But what I'll say is, like in May, and this is the image that you see shortly after the fire, that's the image on the left, you'd expect at this time to start seeing some kind of activity in the oak. Like you'd start to see, if it had survived the fire, you would see evidence of primary growth, like new shoots developing, buds expanding, and that kind of thing. Certainly that would be obvious by this time. You don't see that at all. So that suggests that this tree was already top killed by the fire. Whereas if you look at the shortleaf pine in that same image, you may notice that it's starting to initiate some shoot growth at the top. So it's getting some of that primary growth happening already. So that seedling survived even though it was smaller. And then if you go 2 months later, and that's the image that you see on the right, you can see that, yeah, so that oak again, above ground for the most part, the only growth that you're seeing are low leaves, that is, and those are originating off of sprouts that originated at the base of that tree. So that thing was totally top killed and it's sprouting back. Whereas if you look at the shortleaf, where the blue arrow is pointing, that thing's already put on probably 6 inches of growth at the very top. So it survived, even though it was smaller, it survived that fire. And it survived because of its ability to resist top kill, even at a relatively small size. So, I mean, the things are growing so close to one another, I can't imagine there is that much of a difference in terms of fire line intensity but you can just, if anything, this kind of just speaks to the fire resistance that we see in shortleaf pine and how it achieves that even at a relatively small size. All right, so now another fire adaptation in shortleaf pine that I think is arguably the coolest adaptation that it possesses, and that's going to be the formation of what's called a basal crook, which allows the seedling and the sapling to sprout back after being damaged, which we call a resilience adaptation to fire. So like we think of resilience, this assumes that some kind of damage or disruption has happened to the individual and its ability to bounce back. So that's that resilience spot. It's that the response is more about recovery. Well, the basal crook and the sprouting ability speaks to that resilience, which assumes that some damage has happened and now the individual's having to bounce back. So in this case, shortleaf pine certainly has high levels of individual resistance, but that's only going to work up to a certain point. Certainly, there's going to be fires coming through that are too hot. They're going to overwhelm the resistance of the individual, which is going to top kill it. But shortleaf pine is one of a few species that can survive that by way of sprouting back after. It's like pitch pine is one that does it too, which is pretty interesting. They both co-occur in New Jersey forest, yet they possess this interesting adaptation. And so the basal crook really, it literally is a crook that forms in the base of the stem, right at basically the transition to the root system between the shoot and the root. And it's about where that crook forms that you get dormant buds that if the tree is top killed by fire coming through, so overwhelms the resistance, those buds survive, assuming they do survive, they sprout back. And so that's essentially what you're seeing on the right here. So these basically you get two seedlings of shortleaf pine. You can see all that new growth coming up. Those are the basal crook sprouts that are bouncing back. So this is part of the species resilience adaptation. And I also I found this image today. I'm happy I found this. So this is the one over here. This is actually from Mattoon's 1915 article, actually it's more of a you know pretty large treatment of shortleaf pine, the life history of shortleaf. But just this great illustration, hand drawn kind of illustration, talking about the basal crook formation and just kind of the adaptation of the basal crook, which is just really cool. So I had to include that here. Okay, and so here, just show you again, series of images. This is after that same prescribed fire, but now you're looking at the same seedling throughout the growing season. And so we can see, so this is a seedling that was entirely top killed, and now it's bouncing back via basal sprouting. And so you can see May 2020, seedling totally cooked, basically total needle scorch in this case. But if you look very closely at the base of that seedling, you can note that there's a little bit of green growth going on. So it's starting to sprout at this point. And then a couple months later, July 2020, I could just move so July 2020, you look here are the basal sprouts popping back. So certainly here's the resilience response. But one thing I want to point out is that you have an oak seedling that was here that was about the same size of the shortleaf at the time that the fire came through. It was totally top killed too, and it's sprouting back. But just notice how more vigorous those oak sprouts are. And here's another black oak in this case. It's just the sprouting is just much faster and just really like occupies more growing space early and faster in sprouting hardwoods than in shortleaf. So this kind of brings into question like how competitive are these little sprouts here off of shortleaf compared to these really rapid growing oak sprouts in this environment? Like who's going to win in the long term between these two, for example? Those are questions that we're still trying to work out. Now, if you look at the end of the same growing season, this is after the same growing season here. So November 2020, this is an image of that same seedling. And I got the numbers here. So after one growing season, this one individual, this is seedling tag number 2012. It had 30 live sprouts attached. So that's pretty amazing just to still have 30 live sprouts at this point. And the largest measured was 30 centimeters tall, or about 1 foot. I did the most recent measurement would have been January of this year, so almost a year ago. I did a measurement, and that group of 30 is now just one. So this is 5 growing seasons past. Now it's just one, and it's 6 feet tall. That sounds great, but it's overtopped by hardwood. So again, this speaks to the competitiveness. Like, yeah, maybe the sprouting ability helps to keep shortleaf on the landscape, helps it to persist within a community, but I'm not sure if it's going to be as successful in ensuring its recruitment long-term and persistence long-term under current forest conditions. So these are some questions that I know we're trying to answer. It's not just me, but there are others working on this too. Of course, no talk about a tree species and its ecology and silviculture would be complete without talk of its shade tolerance. And so in the case of shortleaf pine, like other hard pines, we generally throw it into the category of being shade intolerant. So it's classified as shade intolerant. It's not going to regenerate particularly well in shade. It's not certainly not going to continue to advance and reach reproductive maturity in shade. It just doesn't really have that capability. But it's going to require some type of canopy opening or a degree of canopy openness that's going to really kind of facilitate that advancement and eventual ascension into the overstory and reaching reproductive maturity and therefore permitting its persistence long term. So so this is one where I like to step back for a moment and think about shortleaf pine and some of these species more broadly. So we identified shortleaf as a species that's adapted to fire, it's adapted to drought conditions, it's shade intolerant, for all the things we've talked about. So really there's like you need fire to help shortleaf pine. It helps to kind of keep competition at bay. It maintains a seed bed that's good for shortleaf regeneration, for seedling establishment. And if you have a frequent enough fire regime, it tends to keep the forest at a lower density such that you can tend to get more of a gappy canopy, more canopy openness extensively within those communities. And then if you happen to get a long enough period without fire, so you get a long enough period without fire, if you have seedlings established, that's going to give them a chance to recruit and get into the overstory. So it's really, you kind of need all these things in place to be able to grow and sustain shortleaf long term. And what we find ourselves in increasingly today is that in our fire suppressed forests, we just have kind of like mature, dense forests, which really are not conditions conducive for shortleaf pine regeneration. And where shortleaf pine is present, they're usually just present as large overstory trees in that situation. And when gaps form, they're not necessarily able to take advantage of that because the seedbed conditions are not suitable for them because fire hasn't prepared a seedbed for them. So if anything, we may be seeing accelerated loss of pine because some of those disturbances are knocking out the pines or diseases are getting into the pine, such as southern pine beetle. It's taking out the pine seed source. So you kind of need all these things in place to be able to sustain shortleaf. And so, and also just kind of point out this picture here. So this was in Wharton State Forest, probably about a maybe tenth of an acre to a quarter acre sized gap. So not a really large canopy gap by any means. But the shortleaf is advancing wonderfully within this. And I mean, there's pitch pine around this gap edge as well, but it's like pretty much just shortleaf. There's very few pitch pine that were coming into this gap. And this is an area certainly with the history of prescribed fire period that's kind of maintained the right mix of conditions to be able to get a seedling catch of shortleaf and to advance it to a larger size class and hopefully get it into the overstory. But again, we kind of need all these things in place to be able to sustain a shade intolerant species that in many ways is dependent on fire disturbance for long-term persistence. Okay, so let me say I'm going to shift gears here for a moment, but Rich, I don't know. I know we had some other polling questions.
We
Did we
do.
want to try to deploy the next round
Sure,
of polling questions?
absolutely. There were a couple other things I did want to note just scanning through the chat while you were talking. First of all, we got a whole bunch of hellos from all over the state, which is really appreciated. But the
Cool.
best one is Holly, who's on an Amtrak train from Massachusetts to New Jersey. So she wins the traveling award.
Nice.
And she also asked a question, is it fair to say shortleaf pine is shade intolerant? And
Yeah,
is and she asks, is it a fast or slow growing species?
that is a great question. It in the early part of its life, it's generally speaking a slow growing species. Its growth is very conservative, which often kind of coincides with species that are drought tolerant. So it's like one of the trade-offs with drought tolerance, oftentimes is going to be kind of like slower growth. In part because it is investing a lot below ground, but it is just kind of a slower growing tree. And one of the reasons why it isn't favored in plantation management. So you don't see extensive plantations of shortleaf pine, not like you do loblolly pine, in part because in a short period of time, in a short rotation, shortleaf pine is never going to be able to produce as much wood per acre as something like a loblolly pine. Um, yep. But long
Uh,
term, it's more of like an extended rotation species. For long term, it's more consistent growth. It actually starts in terms of its growth rates. It actually starts closing the growth gap with species like loblolly and others as it gets to older, more advanced stages.
what height do we expect them to grow to?
So much of that's going to be based on site quality, but like here in Stockton Woods, some of our taller shortleaf are 70 feet tall, maybe even a little bit taller. I've seen it down in South Arkansas, 115 feet tall.
Wow. So just trying to track the questions to the sections of your presentation. One more I will throw at you. sorry to interrupt, but
No, that's fine.
if you're not in an area with fire, would you recommend planting this within a reforestation project is the question.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like I think if it's like, so if this is more of like, say, afforestation where you're putting trees back into a place where trees used to be, but maybe hadn't been for a long time because it was in agriculture or something, for sure. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But what goes along with something like that is that there's going to be a need for probably some site preparation for competition control early on. And you got to select a good seed source. Like how are you going to regenerate the site if you don't have local seed availability? If you do have local seed availability, there are other approaches you might take. This is a good question. If anything, this is a good segue into like we're actually publishing a management guide for shortleaf pine that might kind of help address some of these questions. It would help to inform certainly landowners and resource managers on how they might go about recruiting shortleaf pine in their property.
And just closing out the fire subject, are you aware of any what's referred to in the question as mega fires in shortleaf pine areas?
I mean,
Or
other than not so much. I mean, just because it does occur in southern New Jersey, so where we have like our equivalent of a mega fire. Certainly, some of those fires have impacted areas where there is shortleaf. Um, Maybe in some western parts of the range, you get into like Texas and Oklahoma and stuff. They had some pretty bad fires out that way that maybe burned into some shortleaf. Um, but no, that's a good question. I don't really think of shortleaf as being a species that's going to be as well adapted to the really high intensity fire that something, say, a pitch pine is. But certainly with it's more of like a low to moderate intensity severity fire or intensity fire, that's something where shortleaf is often going to have kind of a better chance.
okay, I'll launch that second poll if it's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I think we can start addressing the first one, which is which species is more likely to grow with a straight stem. Okay, you've educated us, Matt. We're completely hypnotized. It's shortleaf pine,
Nice.
right? This is a good one. The second one, shortleaf pine is grown extensively on timber plantations. It says false as the majority answer.
Mhm.
What is the answer?
That is false is the correct answer.
Okay. And number three, a stand of multiple tree species is generally more resilient than one with a single species. And true is the overwhelming response.
Yep. Kind of spreading the risk amongst multiple species. Cool. Well, great. It's a good
Yep,
answers.
yep. I'm just downloading the results to memory so that we don't lose them. Go right ahead.
Cool. Cool. Yeah, so I'm going to speak briefly because I'm looking at the time here and we are creeping up on 8. Um, so maybe I can kind of expedite some things here, maybe not quite gloss over too much, but so yeah, I just want to speak a little bit about kind of where we were in the past and where we are today in terms of shortleaf pine, to kind of frame some of the conservation concerns that we have around the species. And pictured here, I got to put a shout out to Jim Goulden, who's one of my forest forest science heroes. I guess I could say big shortleaf pine advocate, did a lot of work in Arkansas and um, in the Ozarks and such, focusing on shortleaf, particularly in the Ouachita Mountains, so in the interior highlands, but did a lot of work there. Now retired with the Forest Service or from the Forest Service. All right, so just for starters, kind of where we were. So as of late 1800s, one estimate, of course, when you look at the estimates, there's a little bit of a range, but I'd say the one that I've seen the most often cited is there was something like an estimated 75 million acres of pure shortleaf or shortleaf hardwood forest at that time. So these would be forest types where shortleaf is a major component that we could describe something like 75 million acres within shortleaf's range at that time would be kind of classified as a shortleaf dominated natural community, right? So, over 100 years ago, but that's kind of where kind of we start this, and we can use that as our baseline for comparison. So what you see here are basically the locations of forest inventory and analysis plots spanning the 22 state range of shortleaf pine, where at least one shortleaf pine was recorded back in 2010. So this gives you some sense of what the current distribution is of shortleaf. And these would be larger trees, not this doesn't include seedlings as far as I know. I think this is just like kind of overstory trees or just, larger potentially like seed producing trees. And for those that aren't aware, so FIA is a Forest Service program that basically takes stock of the nation's forests, periodically works with states and others to kind of maintain an inventory of the nation's forest. That way they can kind of see where we are today and compare it to where we were in the past and evaluate trends. And I mean, really just a fantastic program. Can't say enough about it. But so that's where this data is coming from. And so within that range, so what you see represented here is roughly 10% of the FIA plots across the full 22 state range. So just so although I know it kind of looks like, because these are the spots are actually enlarged, the little dots were enlarged, so it becomes real obvious. But in reality, those plots only make up roughly 10% of all of the plots that occur within the range. So still, we're not saying like shortleaf is being recorded on lots and lots of plots within the range, only about 10% with at least one recorded. And so if we delve into that data a little bit more, what we see is that shortleaf pine we would describe as being primarily a minor component of the forest communities where it was detected. And that's kind of depicted in this figure here, which shows kind of the green and yellow areas. That represents areas where shortleaf pine is really of low abundance. It's kind of just a part of the forest, but it's not really at high density or anything like that. It may be kind of locally abundant, but it's not extensive by any means. It's really just kind of a minor component of the forest. But you do see some hot spots out within the range, and it's mostly in the western and northern part of the range. So in the interior highlands of the Ozark Plateau and the Ouachita Mountains. Particularly, you can see the Ouachita where it shows up bright red. That's the Ouachita Mountains, which are kind of like the Ridge and Valley. If you're familiar with the Ridge and Valley of the Appalachians, they're just these long ridges, parallel ridges that are separated by narrow valleys. Very similar kind of physiography in the Ouachita. But in this case, the mountains are east-west trending. The ridges are east-west trending, so they have a really long south-facing ridge and a long north-facing side of the ridge. Or as I should say, a long south-facing slope and a long north-facing slope. And it's on that south slope, you often find just very, very dense shortleaf pine and up on the ridge tops. On the other side, it's quite interesting. It can be actually very much like what you find in the southern Appalachians. So it's kind of disjunct populations of species that are more common in the southern Appalachians you find on the north side of those ridges. But certainly where we find shortleaf really at its highest abundance, where it's most important in terms of relative abundance compared to other species in the forest is going to be in the interior highlands. And it's just more of kind of diffuse species throughout much of the range. Okay, so kind of keep this in mind. So when we described before late 1800s, shortleaf pine dominated forest estimated at something like 75 million acres. Well, if we classify according to the same criteria or something similar, what we see is currently maybe about 6.3 million acres of shortleaf pine forest today. So we're talking about roughly a 92% reduction in this forest type, which is, again, we talk about conservation concerns. This is a major concern. We're really kind of losing the species that has a really important history, has certainly tremendous timber and ecological value. It has a value from, and we'll discuss this more from a climate adaptation standpoint as well. And it's just it's happening, and it's one of those we just haven't really been able to act on it quite as much. We're kind of doing it here and there where it makes sense. But this is part of our concern as a group of enthusiasts and promoters of shortleaf pine conservation. Is we're really trying to get this message out of like we really need to be concerned about this as a society. We need to try to take action. So you could kind of think of maybe what you see here. Here's an image of
Matt,
shortleaf. Yeah,
could you just jump back one page for a second? The question
yeah,
was, what are the yellow blocks on the left-hand map at the top?
yeah. I see. I should know that better. I'm pretty sure that's where it's been perhaps introduced or planted, or maybe that's where they haven't been verified.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I need my wife. She would tell me. She knows that
Okay.
better than I do.
I'll let you go on that one. Go ahead.
Okay. Right. Yeah. So you can imagine that maybe the image that you see here, the shortleaf pine dominated community, this is in the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. This is being actively restored to create more of an open woodland condition with a ground floor consistent with kind of that natural community type, which is dominated by a little blue stem. Maybe this was a condition. Maybe this is kind of like what a lot of forests looked like back in late 1800s, like stuff that we described as being like shortleaf pine dominated. There have been a lot more of this on the landscape throughout the range than what we see today, right? So this is maybe kind of what historically we might have seen, we might have seen more often. Maybe even something like this. This is shortleaf pine, pitch pine. I'll describe it as a savanna. It's just so open canopied. It's got this really thick grassy understory. It's not really quite a forest. It's maybe kind of getting toward a woodland a little bit, but just a little too open. And this is actually one that Bob Williams, I know he was a part of the management of this out at Lemke Farms near Mays Landing. Really, really interesting site. Maybe we had a little bit more of this back in the 1800s too than what we have today.
By the way, Liz typed in yellow is rare,
Oh,
means rare.
nice. Thank you. I owe you one. All right. Okay. So kind of think of like maybe this is kind of what we were in the past, but this is more of what we're seeing today. So where we see shortleaf pine, it's really occurring more as a minor component in mixed species forest. So areas, maybe sites that historically had a lot more shortleaf, just through succession and um, just shortleaf pine trees dying and not being replaced by themselves. Again, succession happening and being replaced by oaks and other hardwoods. We've kind of slowly lost the shortleaf pine component to the point now where we have these kind of legacy shortleaf within these predominantly hardwood dominated stands, where they're just kind of little patches within a matrix of hardwoods. And so this seems to be much more of what we see today and what the data is suggesting. Now, not to say, I mean, there's still some areas where shortleaf is going to be pretty abundant, but just not quite what it was historically. And interesting, when I was looking at Mattoon's paper in 1915, he was saying the same thing. He was saying that shortleaf is probably occupying much less than what it had occupied, say, 30 years before. And there's a variety of reasons for shortleaf's decline, fire suppression being a big one, but then also exploitative cutting that targeted shortleaf because it was a desired timber species. Southern pine beetle certainly has had its impact on shortleaf pine. Like early 2000s, there was a really bad outbreak in parts of the Mid-South that took out a lot of shortleaf. Of course, land conversion to agriculture, residential development, so encroachments on the habitat itself. Is it just a litany of different things? There's also this disease called little leaf disease, which is arguably the most influential disease within shortleaf's range. It's really disease complex, a lot of factors that cause it, but it's decline in shortleaf pine that happens predominantly within the Piedmont south of us. So there are a variety of reasons why we've lost shortleaf pine, but a lot of it's just kind of benign neglect. That we've been so effective at suppressing fires, we haven't maintained the right conditions or really the right set of conditions that shortleaf pine really thrives under. So that just the environment has changed. Okay, so now let's talk about shortleaf pine, kind of wrapping things up here a bit, thinking more in terms of its adaptation and why I think it's not just me, but certainly why I think it's a good species for New Jersey, thinking as a species for the future, more climate smart forestry and adapting our forests to projected future conditions. And so, as I pointed out, shortleaf pine, it is certainly adapted to warmer conditions than what we currently experience. As you can see, we're at the very northern edge of the range, right? It's in this case like one direction for the range to go. That is, it's extending north as conditions warm. So certainly, it's got that going for it. It seems to be well adapted to extreme weather, which would include droughts. So certainly has drought tolerance and maybe elevated wind resistance and wind firmness with that deep taproot and that concentration in root growth and large root system relative to shoot. And then also it possesses fire adaptations. So these are kind of all things that we kind of feel could be happening. Certainly it's happening in New Jersey for us, but maybe we could expect a little bit more of this into the future. And so because of this, shortleaf certainly is a species to think about. And one thing I want to point out as well is like what you see in these images. So the image that you see to the far left, I mean, what that represents is shortleaf's current geographic distribution. Those little spots out there are FIA plots symbolized based on shortleaf's relative abundance. So the bluer just means the more abundant, the green, the light greens means it's less abundant within the plots. And then you see kind of the red outline, and that represents the Little's historical range map for shortleaf. And then what you see then to the center and to the right there, those are habitat suitability projections out to 2100. So that's like if you project out to 2100, what's the habitat suitability for shortleaf pine? What is that potentially going to look like under a moderate warming scenario and under a severe warming scenario? And you can see kind of how that habitat, obviously, that habitat suitability is shifting north, or at least it's certainly expanding north. So areas where we don't see shortleaf pine currently, certainly the habitat is kind of improving for it under those warming scenarios. So it kind of suggests that, yeah, shortleaf pine is probably a good species to think about from a environmental change global change perspective. And then you can see, so kind of put some context here. So the moderate warming scenario, that's more of like if we actually take action today to limit our carbon emissions. Like if we take much more of an active role, policy gets put in place, whatever. It's just that's where we're doing more of that to try to reduce carbon emissions and actively fight climate change that way. The severe warming scenario is almost more of the business as usual. That's like if we just continue on track the way we are, that might be perhaps what we expect. In a sense, the good news is a species like shortleaf pine is one that is considered well adapted to either one of those scenarios, and conditions seem to be improving statewide. Maybe not. It's interesting. You look at the moderate warming scenario. Maybe it's not improving as much in South Jersey, but I think that's really improvement in habitat suitability relative to where it is today. In a lot of ways, like it's shortleaf is still here. I mean, it's certainly here in southern New Jersey. It's present. I don't see that changing under that scenario, but you can certainly see where shortleaf seems to be a species primed for the future in New Jersey forests. And then in
So now
addition to,
we
well,
talk about extreme weather, and
yeah,
in our heads we think of rain and drought.
right.
How about wind? Is it a wind resistant species?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think that is a kind of a co-adaptation, if you will, that goes along with growing on those exposed landforms where it tends to be droughty. Those are also sites that tend to experience a lot of wind. So I feel like shortleaf with that deep taproot and that concentration and below ground growth, it really gives it quite a bit of wind firmness. It also has a fairly strong stem, like that nice consistent growth pattern that you see in the species. It forms a nice symmetrical crown, nice straight stem, all of which kind of displaces its weight in such a way that it seems to withstand wind pretty well. It's less likely to kind of buckle over as it gets larger. So I really do think that it's a pretty wind firm species, therefore good when you consider other aspects of extreme weather.
Thanks.
So with that, kind of looking at my time here, I think it's perhaps time to start wrapping up a bit. But I do want to kind of point out some other resources on shortleaf pine if folks are interested in kind of learning on your own. So certainly there's the Silvics of North America. It's a project itself that has chapters that are individual species, and you can learn pretty much everything you want to know about the species. But just keep in mind that the Silvics of North America were last published back in 1990, or not originally, I shouldn't say. The most recent update was back in 1990, and they're in the process of updating. And I think that's still happening now. So like basically new information is going to be coming out there, but they basically set up a nice website where you can search the different species and that kind of thing. So certainly you can learn about shortleaf there. And then there's this thing called the Shortleaf Pine Initiative, which again, this is all about trying to restore shortleaf and trying to kind of promote its conservation. There's a whole initiative now, much like Longleaf Pines Alliance, or another longleaf pine focused initiative. They have a nice website with a bunch of resources available that you can look into. And then coming soon, basically have a journal article coming out in the Journal of Forestry that's focused on shortleaf pine. A lot of stuff that I talked about in today's talk is going to be in that publication. And then we have a book coming out hopefully in 2026 or 2027 that, to be quite honest, is kind of embarrassing. I don't know what the title is. I couldn't find it in any of the email string. I'm not sure we've settled on a title yet, but it would be something to the effect of the ecology and silviculture of shortleaf pine. And I co-wrote a chapter on even age silviculture for that. So that's going to be a nice resource for landowners and resource managers. And so with that, just want to thank you for your time. And I guess,
Well, we have a few more questions.
yeah,
How
sure.
about where can one get shortleaf pine?
Okay, so that is a good question. So our state nursery is growing shortleaf pine. So that would be one spot to source shortleaf would be in the state nursery in Jackson. So it'd be one place to
Okay,
consider.
that's you go to their website and they post what seedlings they have available and
Yeah,
when
yeah,
they're available, and they
exactly.
also post them based on size of seedling and price them accordingly. But when they have seedlings, they generally have good quantities, and it's just a thing you have to watch and you want to act quickly on when they post.
Yeah, yeah. So it's one of those where, yeah, they post that catalog online and you want to be, and I don't know if you can get alerted. I don't know if they have alerts like when it gets posted
I'm
that
not
that
sure of that, but certainly it's something to watch
if and it
if
would
you're
be something
planning,
to
if
look
you're
into.
looking.
Yeah, 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 it's definitely
Okay.
because they will sell out quickly on things.
And I know it's not a common question in New Jersey, but in other areas where where their species is more prevalent, are there actual wood product markets?
Oh, for
Oh,
shortleaf? Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah. So like I know like in Missouri, like for fence posts, they were basically using smaller diameter shortleaf. for fence posts. That seemed to be one of the big markets there. There is use for it as structural timbers. I mean, it produces a good structural timber, but again, they're not growing it in plantations intensively for that. That's going to be mostly loblolly and Douglas fir and that kind of thing. Um,
And so, and what about deer resistance?
okay, so what I find is the deer tend not to eat shortleaf pine. Like they might nip a little bit incidentally here and there, especially if they're nursery grown and you're planting them out, because they might be pumped with nutrients or something. The deer might find them a little more tasteful. But for the most part, I don't see a lot of damage other than buck rubbing on shortleaf pine seedlings.
So would you suggest moderate fencing?
Yeah, yeah, you might consider putting up just like a cage for a little bit till it gets going. Um, that might be one option.
Here's somebody commenting that it was used to rebuild boardwalks after Sandy.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up, and that's okay. So I know part of the story goes that a lot of that was sourced from the Ouachita National Forest. So I know that there's some heavy orders that were like filled out and shipped from there. Yeah, so that's again, so good structural timber, good rot resistance. It's got some good properties. So something like that type of outdoor use would be good. Log
Do
cabin
you have
homes.
any species you would suggest pairing with shortleaf pine if you're planting?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. Thinking in terms of species compatibility, you just don't want
Yeah,
something that's going to outgrow it and overtop
yeah,
it. So you wouldn't want to plant it alongside of like a loblolly pine. But if you plant it with like a white oak, might not be a bad idea because white oak's a little bit slower growing, and it can certainly grow underneath of a short leaf and do fairly well. So that might be a
yeah.
nice
We talked
compatible
about
mixture.
avoiding. You and I talked about avoiding tulip poplar,
Yeah, you definitely do not want to plant tulip poplar alongside of a short
or
leaf.
you don't want to plant it near existing tulip poplar.
Oh
But
yeah, yeah.
yeah, are there
But
any special measures that have to be taken when planting the tree of the species?
yeah, yeah. It just depends on the planting site. So if it's a site where maybe you have some kind of a restriction, like say a pan in the soil or something like that, a restrictive layer, like ripping has been used as a site preparation method. That's pretty intensive. That's like actually using, if anybody's familiar with ripping, but that's actually subsoiling. So I know that they've recommended some of that. Um, for the most part, I think most of our planting sites, especially on the coastal plain, our soils are so loose that's not really as much of an issue. But yeah, I guess just being aware of the fact that you may be planting shortleaf on drier sites, which can sometimes be kind of more rocky and lithic,
Yeah.
that you're going to need something that can kind of bust through that. So kind of a good planting bar or something could help you out in that regard.
Yeah, we have, I mean, it's pretty rough here in the north. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
Yeah. Many farmers say that they're farming rock.
Right.
So, so it is quite difficult. And so that may present a challenge, but actually do have a section of field that I want to talk to you about, Matt. So
Oh, nice,
may be
nice.
able to devote it to that and do some afforestation. So here's a
Cool, cool.
question. A couple of more questions have popped up.
Yeah.
Uh, what are the wildlife values of shortleaf pine?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. You know, it's a species that was so widespread, and it is so widespread. But as I said, like we've been losing it throughout its range. That certainly there have been a wide range of species that would benefited from having mature shortleaf. Red cockaded woodpecker. You know, of course, we're getting outside of New Jersey. We start thinking about red cockaded woodpecker. But I know in parts of the range where there is red cockaded woodpecker, they are inserting nest boxes and things like that in shortleaf. Like in the Ouachita, they've been doing that in the Ozarks, Arkansas Ozarks, maybe even the Missouri Ozarks a little bit on the Mark Twain National Forest. Brown-headed nuthatch is another one. That's more kind of west of the Mississippi River, where that's been a little bit of a focus.
There
Red-headed
was a
wood.
comment earlier about shortleaf pine decline mirroring decline in northern bobwhites.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that would be another because it's kind of that open woodland habitat where with more of the herbaceous understory, kind of that habitat condition, more of that shortleaf dominated natural community would support a wide range of species. So there'd be a lot of species that would get captured with that. So red-headed woodpecker is another one that would fall into
A-
that.
And would clay soil be prohibitive to planting?
It can be, and that's if it's a soil that can get really wet and waterlogged for times of the year, and then can also get super dry. those are some conditions where you have to be careful with shortleaf because those are conditions that predispose shortleaf to the little leaf disease where you have other factors present. But that's kind of associated. Those are the site conditions sometimes associated with the little leaf disease.
Mhm.
As far as I know, I don't think it's very common in New Jersey. It's further south of us where that disease complex arises. So, but I would be a little concerned about a soil like that. But it just kind of depends on where that soil occurs on the landscape. Or you're talking about a slope site, or is it like the base of a slope that's going to get really wet? It's a lot of questions would have to be answered with that. But I would say generally no, but there's some other things you'd have to follow up on.
Okay, fair. Just looking to see if there's anyone else out there or anything we have not responded to. Um, there's a general question about the expectation that southern species start to thrive further north. And I think that's really inherent in your analysis.
Yeah, yeah. Now, the one thing you have to be, if you are, say, interested in planting shortleaf on your property and you're, say, a little bit outside of the range, is that you have to be patient with it because you may actually notice some winter injury, elevated winter injury on your plantings and a little bit of dieback initially. That's always one of the risks that you're going to run as you start moving a species north of their range, is that you're kind of like outpacing their winter hardiness a little bit. And we've seen that in some plantings of shortleaf where some of the further south genetics have been planted further north. And it's those individuals, those from sourced from further south, tend to suffer higher levels of winter injury, which can slow their growth and sometimes negatively impact their survival. But we generally find that as they kind of acclimate to the site and as conditions are warming, they tend to start doing better.
And how much growth can we expect per year in a shortleaf?
It's as far as height growth.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot
Yeah,
of
I mean
people who
that's
plant, they want to know, what am I going to see in a year? What am I going to
you
see
know, and again,
in
it's yeah, it's going to depend on your site quality, but like a site index of say like 50 or 60 is probably not totally off the mark in our area. So you might expect something like a foot a year for the first 50 years, maybe a
Mhm.
little bit less, maybe a little bit more depending on your quality.
And if you were to plant them sort of plantation style, what sort of spacing would you use?
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, I mean, I'm more inclined to plant them a little thicker just to compensate for mortality, I guess. And then
Hmm.
you could always thin it down. Um, But I would say something like maybe like 6 by 6 is way too tight, but maybe like a 8 by 10 or something like that. Or
Yep.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, 8 feet within rows, 10 feet between rows, or
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Just looking back one more time. Um, but it looks like I think we responded to everyone and you responded to them in your presentation. So I thank you so much for that. I
Cool.
learned a lot tonight and I'm anxious to follow up with you on my own planting plan. So I kind of try to figure that if I'm interested, others may be as well. So Matt, is this anything you would be willing to discuss with anybody offline?
For sure. Yeah, and in fact, that's kind of something I was hoping to get out of this is that if folks have any interest in shortleaf pine on their property, I do have this. I'm kind of got concepts of a plan for a project that might involve kind of statewide planting. Maybe not a replicated study in different regions, but it could take different forms. But it'd be neat to kind of have a planting study, even if they're a little different at the different sites, where we can kind of just see how shortleaf performs, maybe across different physiographic regions or something within the state.
And so if you want them to contact you, how should they contact you if they want to contact you? Either way.
Yeah, yeah. What I can do is I can just put my email in the chat.
Okay, that would be cool. And I can throw up the next poll. You had one more poll, I believe.
Yeah,
So that would be poll number 3. I think that you've made your points clearly from the way the poll came in. The th question 3 is very interesting to me. You and I debated this one a little bit, and this is really looking to say, is there a reason to go to the Forest Service and ask them to consider introducing shortleaf pine?
yeah. I just think it's state land. It's our land in a way. I
Yeah.
just wonder what folks' perceptions are about that on public land. If that's
Yep.
even if it's considered kind of outside of the range, how willing are people to move a species that's technically outside of the range to that area? Which I guess depending on how you define where the range limits are. I mean, it looks like as you say, like there's evidence that it existed at a time up in parts of New York, so maybe technically
Mhm.
it's all within the range. But yeah, gauging interest.
Excellent. So I want to thank you for coming this at this time of year because it's often very difficult to schedule people. And I want to thank the audience for attending because it's the same thing for them. I know they have a lot of family commitments. So thank you, thank you. We much appreciate your help to the association, your support of the association, your willingness to present almost anywhere, anytime, and to handle a walk in the woods and other things that you've done for us. So thank you so much and truly appreciate it. A lot of accolades coming through, but I would like to conclude with just reading a little bit of thank yous to various people for the year. If folks would stay on, I'd appreciate it. Um, we want to express our thanks to everyone who's supported and joined or donated to the association in 2025. Anybody who's joined already for 2026, and we've had a large number, and with all those who attended our webinars, our annual meeting, our education events. We want to thank our webinar presenters, our annual meeting presenters, the various conservation organizations who collaborated with us in 2025. Want to call out Rutgers Cooperative Extension for helping us out, particularly with our annual meeting and some other programs, Stockton University, where Matt is an associate professor, the New Jersey Forest Service and the USDA, as well as some very special and generous donors who we thank from the bottom of our heart. There are a lot of government agencies who get involved with us, including the New Jersey Forest Service, New Jersey Forest Fire Service, New Jersey Fish and Wildlife, as well as on the federal level, the USDA, NRCS, U.S. Forest Service. Finally, I want to thank our legislators who sponsored and supported bills which support responsible science-based forest and wildfire forest management and wildfire defense management for sustainability and resilience and encourage private landowner investment in the future of our forests, including support for the Farmland Assessment Program. 2025 was a year of challenges to science-based forest conservation and to private woodland ownership. I hope you'll agree that the NJFA and its officers and board did an incredible job in representing our forests and forest landowners in New Jersey in 2025. So I thank you all for your support. This is a labor of love for me. None of our officers are compensated. Of course, our board is all volunteer. And so we really appreciate you being here and just being part of the effort. So thank you so, so much. I wish everyone a joyous holiday season and a truly happy new year.
Hey, Rich.
Yes.
So I'm seeing in the chat that evidently I tried to share my email contact, but I don't think it's coming through. What I might do is, if can I share my screen one more time so people? Yep. So there's my email contact right here. And if you'd like to send a message to me, questions, or if you're interested in planting shortleaf or just want to talk more about the species, reach out.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt.
Cool.
Matt, have a great holiday season.
Yeah,
Thanks for
you do the
joining
same,
us
Rich.
tonight. And
Yeah, and I
everybody,
also want to thank the audience. Thank you so much for the great questions and participation in the poll and all that kind of thing.
yeah, thank you all so much. Happy holidays.
Take care.
Take care.